Hello and welcome back to the worst Warmachine channel on the internet. I'm Dorian, and this here is not a video brought to you by my wonderful patrons, but it's actually a video brought to you by Jake Paints Minis. So today, Jake Paints Minis put out a video that is called, and wait for it, Warmachine Hordes in 2021, It Sucks. Now, first of all, I'm the clickbait guy here. What are you doing? Get off my yard. Stop stealing my gig. But really what I want to do is make a reply to this because, as you may have thought, this video is talking about how they think that Warmachine sucks right now. I'm going to have a link down to it below so that you can watch it yourself. I don't know if they're going to plan to take it down or anything. If they do, I can't control that. But it's a 30-minute video. So what I did is I wrote down all the main points, kind of rambles through it, but all the main points are the reasons why Warmachine sucks right now, and then I want to address them here. So if you'd rather watch it yourself first, it's down there below. But otherwise, I'm going to give you the real points right here. Now, one way I could do this video as a real like reaction, counterpoint to be like, "Whoa, Jake, you're an idiot, you're a moron. Here, let's take your points one by one, and I'm going to tell you why you're a goddamn moron." But you know what? That's not going to really work, because if you ever talk like that to somebody, they're just going to tune you out, right? Nobody wants to be talked like that, and it'll just really start like an us versus them, especially because they kind of talk about how they're going to be playing other games instead. You can just tell this is going to be like, oh, well, this is a, GW versus PP thing or something like that, and that's not the way I want this to go. I want to cover the points that he talks about, and then honestly give my thoughts on it. So I'm going to put my press ganger thing on here and do my best to, defend Privateer Press. But at the end of the day, Malorian tell the truth. And so if Jake in some of these cases says something that's like, yeah, that'd be bad, point given. Like that's the way it goes. So let's get into it. The very first thing that Jake says in it is that he's bored. And I can understand that. I mean, especially when it comes to the second one here, where he says, like, it's just not fun. It's become stale. And he goes on to explain how he's living in this 8-person meta. Now, this is always something that can happen in a meta that doesn't really fluctuate, right? If you get into a meta where everybody kind of locks into their favorite list and then decides, well, based on the other 7 of you, this is what I'm going to be running every week. You come in, it's kind of more of a case of which one of you 7 do I play? And that's the game. I used to be in my first 40K group, the same thing, right? There's this little basement group of 4 of us, and it got super stale, and basically it just completely dissolved. Now, how do you stop these things from happening? And I'm going to talk about this before we get to anything else here, is you have to identify yourself that saying that your group is getting stale. I mean, one way you could be saying this is that it can be up to the company. They can be doing more releases. They can be doing more mass changes like Mark IV. And I mean, you ask for that stuff later, but at the end of the day, it's not like everyone always buys into each of these different things. A lot of times people just stick with their own models, right? And so sometimes you have to take this on yourself and decide, you know what? Look, fellas, this is stale. What are we going to do? Are we going to do it so that this day is going to be serious tournament prep day, and then this day is going to be jank day, and you got to bring something silly? Do we want to try playing with the points? Do we want to try playing with different formats? You know what? Let's just grab a crazy steamroller from like 5 years ago, 8 years ago, 10 years ago, or let's just make up our own steamrollers. Let's make up a format where it's 2 versus 2. How about 4 players, everybody for themselves? There's a way that you can make these things more interesting, and this is kind of on you to do that. So do know that you have control over this, although sometimes, I'm just going to honestly say right now, if you're bored and you're just feeling everything is stale, sometimes honestly the best thing to do is take a break and then come back, especially with a game like Warmachine, but we'll be talking about why as we go through these other points here. The next one here that I kind of liked hearing was that functionally there's nothing wrong. So I liked hearing that. They said that the way that the game works is functionally great. And again, if I was doing like a real, attack video, I'd be like, oh, got ya. But he, of course, expands on this. Now, one of the problems that he brings up here is all of the rules and the infernal rulings that you have to be looking up all the time. And I actually found this one fairly surprising because I don't find that at all. Now, one thing I can tell from the video is that he does play Scorn, and that there is, you know, the souls that goes around with that. And so that is one part of the rules I find sometimes can be not as simple to follow as others, where if you're like, okay, this thing connects souls, you always give souls to the closest thing, except this thing always says I always get the souls, but then this thing says that you don't get the souls. You know, there's a little bit of interactions with souls in particular that I find can sometimes be a bit of a challenge, but once you learn that once, you have that kind of forever. Otherwise, I mean, one of the real gleaming things of Warmachine is just how purely clear the rules are, right? There's very few things that you actually have to go to infernal rulings for. And in the times that you do, it's there, it's fast, it's easy. I would actually think like back in Mark II, I had more issues with this. We're like, oh, I need an infernal ruling for this. Where is it? Got to look these things up. Now in Mark III, it's actually really, really good. So I'm kind of surprised. I'm going to make a guess that you have an issue with souls. I think that if you're like group of 8, it's kind of like, okay, let's just make a chart. How does souls work when there's this piece and this piece? And then from now on, we're all clear forever. Next one here is it's hard to get a starter set. Kind of really brings up that, you know, some places might have some starter sets, but you like the 2 players, they're hard to get, they're hard to places. You know what? Ding, point for Jake. I can't defend this one. That is honestly a real problem right now with Privateer Press, that they do not have good starter sets. And in my own videos where I've talked about what Privateer Press should do, by golly, one of the biggest ones is that they really need to come out with new starter sets, make them widely available, blah, blah, blah. So Privateer Press, if you're watching this, look how angry you're making people with not having very available and fresh, starter sets for new players to use. So Jake, you got that one. I can't say anything wrong with that. The next one that's on here, though, is that there's no campaign really going on. I mean, we did just recently have the whole Oblivion thing, but overall before that, that was kind of missing. I mean, it did seem like before we'd have some of these pieces. And I mean, I think one of the things that might be tough too is that some of the campaign pieces you wouldn't even understand unless you went to conventions. A great example of this is, did you know there was like this massive battle done at one of the cons where there's this airship and there's these casters in there, players actually playing out the game, and based on the results of how this actually went at this con was going to decide what casters lived and what caster died. But most of the world didn't know about that, right? If you're somebody living in a basement, or well, not living in a basement, but you're a basement gamer, right? You're someone that plays with your best 3 buds, and we don't follow conventions, that stuff. It's not like books are coming out with these, new updates to the story coming out. That being said, this Oblivion campaign did change that, right? We had the Hermit Scrolls coming out on Twitter. We actually had the story happening. I really hope that they continue with this. You did say the other thing here that you actually don't care about the story, which made this one kind of funny to listen to. But hopefully what we've seen is, like in the past, you'd have the books that had the stories in them. They're not doing those anymore. But the Oblivion campaign was a good retake at it. And I like to think that it stopped because of the pandemic, but hey, Privateer Press, ball's in your court. If you want to prove Jake wrong, you got this. Next one that's going to be on here is going to be just the fact that there's lots of rules. So that is true. There is tons of rules in this game, but the issue with this argument here is that it's not really a good or a bad thing. Something that you really have to consider is how deep a game needs to be to actually hit the different preferences of the players playing it. And so what I mean by that is that some players want a game that, like, hey, I got my beer, I got my pretzels, come on, bud, let's throw some dice, because, like the game starts in an hour, so we got to bang this one out, and then off we go. No real care. We're really caring about the game and my beer. This is something to pass some time. However, there's also others out there, like, you know what? I want to test my wits against yours. Sure, we could play chess or something. That gets kind of boring after a while. Hey, I got this Warmachine thing. This is going to be a game of the gentlemen and the ladies as well. This is not, no biases here. But the biggest thing here is that this is a game where you have to have the knowledge to outsmart your opponent. There has to be enough levels of rules, so it's not just like, hey, let's roll a dice each and whoever rolls highest wins. No. This is going to be something where I have to analyze your army and your strategy and figure out how I'm going to be crafting my army so that I can counter yours and play it out turn in the table. And that can only be really done by having enough interaction points, enough decision points that I can truly use my intellect to defeat you. That's always, that's never like one's better than the other, right? The person on one side saying, hey buddy, let's have some fun, and then we'll just roll some lucky dice. Oh, you won, I won, who cares? Let's grab a beer and let's go. That's one side, and there's nothing wrong with that person. And on the other side, you have that gamer that's looking for that intellectual challenge, right? Where they want to prove themselves against the other person. Well, you kind of need that whole gambit. And out of all the games out there, Warmachine's over here, and this is where it's lived. It actually used to live a little bit farther, and they tried pulling it back, and now it's kind of going a little bit farther again. But there's honestly nothing wrong there. And so something I would actually say is that if you feel that this is an issue, maybe you would like one of these other games better, and that's completely fine. There's nothing wrong with that. All right, next one I want to go into is the bad flow and 4-hour games. So the idea that came here was kind of triggering back to the idea of all these rules. You have to look things up. It turns out, obviously they don't run a clock, right? If each player had an hour, how do you get to a 4-hour game? But apparently there's so many times they have to stop and look up rules that things really drag out, and all their games are taking to 3 to 4 hours. And I can super understand that if your games are taking 3 to 4 hours, it's hard to enjoy the game aspect, right? If we're in this game, like, yeah, here comes in my cav, they're going to be charging into your jack. Oh man, now you cast the spell. Oh, how does this work? Okay, let's look this up. Okay, let's go through this. Now, that I can understand how that would suck the fun out of the game for you. But with that really comes down to your own knowledge of the game. I can understand if you're new to the game that some of these things would be coming up. And that's why it's really nice that whenever you have these communities, if you can have those veterans in there so that like if something comes up at this table with some newer players, you're like, hey, whoever veteran over there, Sally, come over. How does this work in? Oh, it's like that. Okay, thank you. Let's just keep going. But that's why I kind of feel you need this game to stay on a clock. And honestly, if you find something where, look, you both honestly don't know how this thing works. You both honestly couldn't just like open up a book and find it, because that's really the best thing, right? If you're like, I don't know how this works. Well, let's look it up. Oh, tough. It's on this page. Oh, there it is. Okay, great. This is how it works, right? But if you don't, just be like, okay, we think it's one of these two ways. Let's just roll a dice, 4+ it, and then after the game, we can look it up. No big deal. No problem with that. But you need to keep that game going for the enjoyment, right? Get this thing going. Do your learning on the outside if you need. It'd all be great if you knew it beforehand, but man, you gotta avoid those 4-hour games. I've heard this complaint from multiple different people where they're like, oh man, I hate this game. It takes so long. Every time I play this game, it's like 3 to 5 hours. It's like, what are you doing, right? Some of these people are not doing clocks. Some of these people are not doing, like scenarios or stuff like that. Like, you have to play the game the way it was designed to be played. Otherwise, yeah, of course it's not going to be enjoyed. So I would say if the rules are holding you back, you've already talked about how there's so many rules. Like I said, do what you can in the time you have. If you honestly feel that you have something that you have to look into an infernal ruling, screw it, 4+ it, move on, look it up later. It doesn't matter. Next one here I want to be talking about, just very briefly, is you're talking about your nitpicking. And you kind of self-identify that your own nitpicking of the game is kind of what's bringing things down for you, right? The more you nitpick it, the more you feel bad. And that can honestly be something that comes up, right? I've warned people before that the idea of a CID forum is actually in a way bad for the game, because once you are literally in the mindset of what is wrong with this, how can I fix this? Well, you automatically take yourself away from that enjoyment, right? If you're just like, no, this is the game. How do I live within the confines of these rules to have a good game? then you live within those confines and have a good game. So you did identify that there. I mean, that might be showing a thing there too, where maybe you do just need a break for a little bit, right? Don't sell your models, don't do anything like that, but plan to come back after, because you said you loved it before. I bet you'll love it again. All right, next one here I want to talk about is the behind the scenes, what's actually happening, and the idea of like Rye Quest and stuff like that. And that is honestly, again, ding, point for Jake. I can't fight this one. Right now, there is kind of seem to be like a curtain that we don't really have a lot of insight of what's going on. Now, of course, that's because we've had the pandemic for a year and a half. We've had people leave. But like I've kind of commented before in my very last video, actually, is that Privateer Press needs to now open up and needs to start interacting with us and know like, hey, wow, that was a crazy year and a half, eh? All right, now full steam ahead. Let's do this. So they were really good with it before, you know. Obviously, there were some personnel changes and stuff like that. But if nothing changed with the company, the hope would be, just like how we had the Oblivion campaign and that type of stuff, there's no reason right now to not think this will be continuing after things open up here completely. So this is, again, Privateer Press. Please listen. This is why I keep telling you to do this stuff, is because people get really worried when you stop talking to them. So make sure you focus on each of your games. Give us updates. You did it before wonderfully. Please do it again, and then we don't need to be worrying anybody about it. Next one here, we'll be talking about Nothing for Scorn. Now, they said, you know, a couple years, 5 years, blah, blah, blah. You know, we could counter things, think, well, actually, this came out at this time. But again, there's no real need for that. The main thing that's probably good to address here is that there was a time where you didn't have to wait long for an update. The way that they actually worked is that 1 year, or one update rather, there would be the Warmachine releases, and every single faction would get a little something, right? Maybe this time everybody gets a second level caster, right? Your epic casters, the 2s, right? And then that would come out. Oh, now everyone's going to get a character unit. Okay, there you go. And then after that, okay, now Horde's turn. All the factions and Hordes, here you go. The reason why they stopped that, or the reason why I understand they stopped that, is because even though everyone equally got things all the time, it was also just kind of felt like a wash of things out there. It's like, things don't feel special for my faction because everyone's getting their little same thing, right? It seemed very samey. Like, well, what was your character, Jack? Oh, okay. What was your new solo you got? Oh, okay. Like, we're all just getting the same things when you want to be like, well, I play Khador because I feel it's identified with this. So why are we all getting the same things? So they are now doing this where it's like, okay, boom, update for this faction, this faction, this faction. And the way it works is that you can wait a long time for your major update. However, thanks to things like Riot Quest, they can be like ding, 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 and do like little releases for everybody else along the way. Which is why, like for Scorn, they got that new amazing like character agonizer, which is super amazing. So even though they haven't gotten to Scorn for a while, like that gift is sure something you can hold on and be like, yes, this is fantastic. This can do so many different things in my list. But, you know, I do understand that frustration. Now, with communication, if Privateer Press was able to give us a roadmap saying these are the next X updates coming out, it would help us see ahead and actually have that hope for all those things. But again, I can defend you, Privateer Press, but now you got to go and defend me and make these things happen and, you know, make it easier for everyone. All right, let's move on to the next one here, which is model issues. And the model issues he was talking with here were things like with the bad resin and stuff like that. Now, I'd planned to grab this model before, and I didn't, so let me just quickly do it now. When we had the Archons coming out, and they had the bad, you know, like flexy resin and stuff, the one that I actually got that for was my Thamrite Archon. And these wings were like, wee, you could really do it all over. Now, right now, they're not like that. I could bend them like they were before, and then they would snap because they're like any other plastic now. So it seems to me what happened there is like when you mix your green stuff type thing for modeling, one's there to kind of like activate the other. And so depending on what ratio go will be how fast it hardens on you. So I feel like that was just an error in that, and that over time it got to where it's supposed to be. But then again, you also had things like the Old Witch 3s, which he didn't bring up, but I know well of, where like whatever they made that leg from, whoa, that model just fall right over, and it was really unfortunate. Now, you have to realize with this here that mistakes do happen, and they did their best to fix it. That old witch issue that to me was the worst of them, you know, like to me, actually, like the bendy wings, I liked, because these wings, I felt like, man, those feathers are going to catch stuff and they're going to break. The fact that they were a little bit flexible actually made me feel a little bit better. But the old witch one, they're like, okay, replacements are coming your way, and they fixed these things. So I think it's just something that they expect, that there are going to be these mistakes, especially when Privateer Press is a smaller company. It is super easy for us to want to compare them to Games Workshop. I do it a lot of times, but then at the same time, we have to remember that since their organization is so much smaller, their quality control is going to be a little bit less, and overall, they do a really good job, you know, when you really think about it. So when it comes to here with talking about things like, oh, model issues, I mean, if you're going to be talking about resin stuff, it's actually really, really good, to be fully honest here. Next one here, just talking about how it seems dead. Now, when it was talking about how the game seems dead, it was more so where we haven't heard a lot of things from Privateer Press. Again, like I was talking about, we just went through this pandemic. The big people that were the faces for the company doing dev chats, you know, they had already kind of like stopped doing these things as they got into the pandemic, and then people left the company and stuff like that during this time. And so I can only hope that once they start things up again, boom, the new faces of the company will start doing these dev chats and things like that, and we'll just spring up again. But let's face it, I mean, like, the whole gaming industry has been dead for like a year and a half, right? Do you know how many tournaments I went to in the last year and a half? Zero. There's a steamroller that I just ran like last month, but other than that, no, nothing of course has been going on. Everyone's been on hold. So I think that's something it's easy to think like, oh wow, this thing's been not hearing anything for a long time, but that's a part of the times. And then it's just up to, again, Privateer Press, listen, get this thing going. They got to prove us all us believers right, and actually start doing this, you know, dev chats and communications and stuff like that. All right, next one on here is expensive. Now, this is a hard one to tackle. So on one hand, and this wasn't even an argument made there, Warmachine has gotten more expensive, right? It used to be cheaper to get into. You know, I could buy a heavy jack for 20 bucks. I remember that quite clearly. Obviously, it's not like that anymore. You know, now when I want to get a brand new unit of something, you better have like somewhere around like $60, $70, $80 ready for a unit. But then again, they're kind of moving away from units and on to jacks and super solos. So it's kind of a weird thing to evaluate. Either way, the main thing is that when you start small with like your $50-ish starter box, if you can find it, and want to grow up to a full 75-point box, there is a large investment in that. However, he went then to talk about other games like, you know, Privateer Press and, you know, things like Marvel Crisis Protocol. And I'm not going to say anything bad about those games. All these games are fantastic. However, none of them are cheap, right? I mean, like, if you want to look for a cheap game, what is that one? Something, there's the one that you do with like the little Hot Wheels and you put guns on them. And so you can like play that entire game for like 15 bucks. Yeah, sure. That's a cheap game. But all these model games, if that's the thing you want to get into, be prepared for this type of a cost. And I mean, you can always just justify this either way, right? Everyone can justify spending money on things. But to me, the money that you'd be spending, let's say like I'm going to be playing Warmachine for 5 years. I'm going to buy up to 2 large armies, right? My 75-point list. And then, of course, like maybe some other pieces. So I could be doing a third list or whatever else, right? What are you thinking you might be spending on all these models, right? $500. Let's say you spend $500 to buy a tons of stuff for one faction, and then you're going to be using that for 5 years. Well, what other hobbies can we be looking at? If you're playing video games, if you're a skier, if you're whatever other type of hobby you're out there, what's going to be your budget over 5 years? Well, it could be $500. It could be much more depending what we're looking at. I think when you look at it that way, it's actually fairly reasonable. So as long as you're not like faction hopping, like in that case there, if you're like, I'm a Scorn player, sure, when you first jump up to 75, that's going to be a spicy check that you're going to be taking out of your wallet. But after that, okay, buy this little update, buy that little update. You might get surprised and have like a big, like, oh, now I have this Immortals list and all these things I want to get for it. But you can't complain about not getting updates and then needing to buy things. It kind of all just like one has to go with the other. But overall, the main thing I'm trying to say here is that when you compare it to other hobbies, it really isn't that bad when you really think about it. All right, next one here was getting into more of the rules, talking about command versus control. So this is one of the examples he was giving about talking about unnecessary rules. Now, the reason why there is command and control, and again, I do see this in newer players, that this is one of the harder ones to get the difference of. So in one case, one applies to units and is really typically how far out you can spread your unit, right? If you are going to be only command 6, all right, well, come together, everyone. Whereas if you're command 10, all right, spread out, fellas. We can do whatever we want. Let's go. And so when you think about it for a unit, that's pretty easy. Whereas on the other side here for control, well, that's always your focus times 2. And then that's how you do. So the idea here is like, well, why don't you just combine and just say it's one rule, right? So anything that has to do about control range would really just be command range. And then on your warcasters, your command could just be whatever that number you need. Your controller, your warcaster, it's not a unit, it's a solo. Your command doesn't even matter, right? So go ahead, make that whatever you want it to be. Here's the problem with this, is that it is different for several reasons. The first one being that not all casters are just solos. Some of them are units. And if you did say that one of them is the same, so that, okay, when I cast this spell, I affect everything in my control range, so control all this stuff. Well, if I'm a unit, you know, like Haley 3 or whatever else, then go out, ladies, go and do whatever you want, because you can go way far out there, right? Like, that just wouldn't work. But even in some of these solos, these things are supposed to be working differently. Look at Harbinger, right? I have things that work out at my control range, and then I also have things that work within my command range, right? And so depending on what you want, that depth of rules allows you to have this, right? So you don't have to say like, oh, this thing goes out this range and this goes out half of that, or whatever you want to do. It does open the door to let you do that. Is it complicated? I don't think it really is. Is it sometimes a spot for confusion? Yeah, I see this in new players all the time. I said that, I explain it, then they're good to go, right? So I feel like it's not that bad. Could it be gotten rid of? Maybe, but I feel like it's not really a thing that's harming anyone right now for sure. The next one here was talking about power text. Now this one is a little bit more interesting. The big thing here first talking about was the idea of open fist. What Jake wanted was pretty much any of the war beasts and warjacks to be able to do any of these power attacks. So in one case, he was talking about like, look at my model, right? You can see it as these big fists, but they're not open fists, so now I can't throw things. Come on, my beast should be able to do whatever, and if I want to say, you go there and throw that thing, go ahead. And sure, I mean, part of me kind of agrees with that, saying like, it makes logical sense. However, one of the things that I always think about is the balancing of the game, and that if you have things with weapons, they're going to be hitting harder, whereas if you have other things with no weapons, well, they're not just innately worse, they can be using their open fists to be like grabbing and throwing things and stuff like that. So it does give that extra flexibility. Are there some models that look like they have open fists but don't have open fists that should go back and errated? Sure, maybe, but I see a value in not giving that to everyone and saying like, okay, freebooter with your clamps, you're going to be my thrower. Hey, Toro with the sword, you're going to be my hitter, right? And something else you all should be keeping in mind when you ask for these things, single-handed throws don't really work usually that often unless you're throwing something really small, and then it's just usually easier to kill them. You usually need 2 open fists for even for it, like the throws to work very well, but that's a different thing for another time. Another one that was interesting was talking about trampling and how he actually said like, well, even your light war beasts and things like that should be able to trample, and just have some little rule where it says like they just stop if they're trying to trample over anything higher, right? Okay, I can understand this. Again, I always find this one funny where like one argument is like, let's go and bring the rule bloat down. And another one says like, what if we made this more complicated? What if we had to expand on this and say like, okay, you can trample, but only things that are smaller than you, right? Instead of just like only big things can trample. But I mean, again, what you're saying isn't necessarily wrong either, right? I think honestly, yeah, sure. If you want to say that your lights can go and trample the infantry, maybe. maybe that's one way to go. Again, this is something where maybe this is like that differentiation between heavies and lights to try and make sure that there's a reason to go for your heavies rather than the lights because they can trample things because they're so big. Maybe the idea is that you have to be 2 sizes bigger. So if you go with that, then that means that your colossals should be able to go over the medium bases. Maybe that's the logic, whatever it is. But it is something that can be looked at. But I think what you're looking at there is this really showing that in depth of the rules and how having things that are complicated and interesting really opens up the tactical options, and that's really the greatest thing about Warmachine. So sure, that's something we can look at, but just know that there's those pluses and minuses there, the game balance, and maybe the changes of like, okay, now you go 2 bases down or whatever you want. There'd be a way that you'd have to balance this. All right, next one I want to be talking about here is that feats being useless, but mainly things were like A beats B. So what the argument being made here by Jake is that, hey, when you go in there and there is my feat that says your thing doesn't work, or I have this thing, but you have something that automatically beats it, that's not fair. Now, that is in other games too, right? Like, oh, you're a Terminator in Terminator armor? Well, suck it, I got a plasma gun, right? Like, we've seen those kind of like counters one thing to the other for a long time. Even just simple things like in most games, like, oh, you're infantry, I'm going to counter it with my archers. Oh, you're archers, I'm going to be countering it with my cavalry, right? Like, things like this are always things where you want to be having the option to be using things that beat other things. If there's not things where like this beats that, then what's the point? Throw on all your Space Marines, roll your dice, and see what happens. However, there is an issue sometimes when you have absolute counters. Where like, ha ha ha, I'm Signar. Oh, your Archidons are all immune to lightning? Like that could be definitely a feel bad, and I got it. But it's very, very rare that those absolute counters are actually going to show up in the game. And even when they do, that's the reason why Warmachine has a 2-list version into it. In other games, that's actually a major weakness of their format, because you go into a game and you're like, oh, you have the guns that are perfectly made to destroy my thing. I guess I lose. Like, we might as well not play this game. I'm done. But at least at this, can be like, okay, I can now build my list pairing so that this has a weakness. So let's make sure that this covers it. Okay, what do you have? Oh boy, you beat this. All right, I better use this list, right? Like, that's the reason why you have 2 lists. And you can go then into all extremes. There's also the idea is that you build one balanced list and one skew list. But again, that's why the 2-list thing really functions and why it's here. And man, if it didn't exist, then things just didn't beat other things. What's kind of the point? So I see this one here as something where you probably ran into a really bad situation where one thing was really negated by the other. And one of the ones that came up here as a specific example here was talking about tough and how, like this opponent has something that has lots of tough. You have something that's a theme that just says, haha, you don't get tough, so I just automatically beat you. Well, in that example, that's not the absolute counter I was talking about, right? In this case, tough is not something you should ever really be relying on. For starters, for tough to be a part of the rule that actually comes up, you had to already get hit and be destroyed. So things are already not going great for you. Secondly, when that comes up, it's not like it automatically happens. It's only a 1 in 3 chance that you're actually going to be tough. And even if you do, typically, unless you have some extra stuff that stops you from being knocked down, you're knocked down, you only have 1 more wound, and something goes like, oh, you got lucky and rolled your tough? Get out of here, right? So, like tough is never something you should be fully going into. And as well, if you have an army that has like a lot of tough infantry and you see something over there that's like good against tough stuff, well, that's why, again, your other lists would be like, all right, my other one has lots of war beasts, not lots of tough. I'm not relying on this. So I don't really feel like something like that should be a feel bad. I mean, again, maybe if you get too much into it, like this is ridiculous, your thing countered mine, and you really went down that negative pathway, that you'd be thinking that this is actually a bad thing for the game. But I think if you went to the positive side and be like, okay, this was the situation, what could I have done differently to deal with this situation? That's to be like, oh, this is why I should have in my off list. I know that I have, let's say I'm trolls or something with lots of tough in my list, or I'm pirates. I know that since I have tough as some of my rules, I should go out there and memorize everything out there that is good against tough, and then either 1, decide that I'm going to try and avoid it by having another list that beats those things, or 2, have things in my list that can sculpt those things out. Oh, what's this? You have a Void Archon? All right, I'm going to be putting this in here to basically hunt down your Void Archons to take that out of the list. Oh, your whole list ignores stuff? All right, on the list too. I've planned for this. I'm ready. So that's something that's kind of more, forethought that has to go into it. Now, this next one was actually, I feel, maybe even a better example of why you might be feeling this. So they talked about an example here about how they went to this tournament and they were all beaten type thing because this person came in and had a better knowledge of the game. Basically, they knew all the counters, they knew all the strengths of what everybody was doing, and then used those weaknesses to beat them. Or in another case, talked about how they just kind of brought like a weaker army even and still beat them with that weaker army. This is why Warmachine is good. If you are in the case where the superior player wins the game the majority of the time, this is a sign that the game is a good platform for that. If you wanted something more where like the superior player comes in and who knows what wacky thing will happen this time, there's other games for that. But that's not Warmachine is. Again, we talked about that spectrum, and Warmachine is way far on that one side where like, look, it is designed where the superior player is going to win. Now that is also, I mean, we talk about superior, right? It's not like you look into them and their heart is made out of 90% gold, whereas yours is only 60% gold, right? In their heart of hearts, they're not a better person than you. However, this is a knowledge-based game, right? It's a knowledge-based game as far as like knowing the strategies and knowing how to peace trade and stuff like that. But it's also a knowledge game as far as like, I got to know your rules. I got to know my rules. I need to know the interactions, and I need to know how to put myself in the best situation to beat you. And honestly, that's when this person should win. So if you want to beat them, you got to beat them at their own game, which is going in, learning what they're trying to do, what you're trying to do, and how you're going to try and counter them. Use that tough thing as a great example, right? On one side, you could be like, this is bull. You had something to beat me. This game's stupid. Flip the table. But on the other side, you can be like, well, wait a second. What would be the counter to this? If I wanted to beat this, is there something I can pinpoint out of your list? Do I just take a secondary list that can counter you? Like, that's the type of thing that I would be more leaning heavily into. And the nice thing is, the more that you have those conversations, the more you as a group learn the game and actually elevate to that level where, like, next time you see that person that knew all these things, well, you're just that much closer, right? And at the end of the day, if you can close that gap, hey, you're going to start winning more of those games, right? The next one that comes in here is having this trust of PP to fix the game and talking more about the radio silence. Now, I almost didn't write this one down because, again, there was like talking about different topics kind of going back and forth, and I only want to write down the unique ones. This one's kind of like the one before, talking about where they're not really having a face right now and it seems dead type thing. But there was this trust element, and that's the part that I wanted to identify. We cannot really go into this with a trust mentality, right? If this is a game you enjoy, the only thing you can do is enjoy it. The game was made in a way that now like, hey, I love this game. I want to play it. So are these people that made the game that you like to play still going to do it? You can only assume yes, right? If you go into everything assuming like, oh, they're just going to screw you over, it's just, why even try? I just don't trust them to do anything that's right. That's a real problem. And I mean, you have to open up your heart and believe that these things are going to be working out okay. And only when you're actually presented with the evidence that things are actually going in the wrong direction, okay, then you take steps against it. Now, in this case here, we've talked about before about, why the silence is there and what's happening, and hopefully PP comes back and does this. But otherwise, we have no reason to think anything else. They've still been doing some CIDs. They've still been doing their releases. They've been doing pieces here and there. And we can only just hope that, like for other companies, there has been a silence. And then, boom, there's going to be dev chats. There's going to be the schedules of what to be looking for going forward. Hey, maybe a new campaign. With this campaign, here, new starter set that's going to be out there for you, right? We can only believe that these things will happen because they make logical sense. And why would we think that Privateer Press would not try and make money, right? Like if we even just go to this like cynical and be like, oh, Privateer Press just wants to make money. Well, how do you make money? You release products, you try and make your game thrive. So even if we go to that part and say like, oh yeah, capitalism, blah, 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 well, then fine. Then that's why we feel that Warmachine should be great, because they want to make money and so they want to sell their product. So they're going to be doing that the best way they can, right? So don't worry. I feel we should always trust Privateer Press to do the right thing. And only in that true absence should we be that, or not even absence, when we see it going the other way, okay, that's when you try and be worried. All right, another last one here, talking about the hating Kickstarters. You know, if you're going to be putting things out, don't be doing this through Kickstarter. If you do it through Kickstarter, that's because you don't have faith in your own product and stuff like that. And this is a tough thing with Kickstarter, with doing that, because it can give off that feel of like, what, do you not trust yourself? You know, I hate these Kickstarters. You know, I actually hate Kickstarters for a different reason, in that it kind of takes the stores out of the element, right? If people are buying things from the Kickstarter and not from the stores, that's a real problem. I believe in pay where you play, but you can't do that if you're paying it to a Kickstarter, but that's separate from these things here. I think another way that you might want to be looking into this is that the reason why Privateer Press does these Kickstarters is, one, they are a smaller company, and trying to do something like a Kickstarter big expansion game and it flopping could ruin the company financially, right? They're small enough that something like this could be a make or break. So Kickstarter does make that safe. Another thing is that it's also a very profitable way to go, right? If they were to go and release RideQuest and being like, hey, here's all these solos, they're coming out to your stores, well, the ones that people liked, people would pick up, and the ones that they didn't, they wouldn't, right? That's just how it kind of works. But when it comes as a box that you have to get onto Kickstarter, and there's all this hype about Kickstarter, and people are like, yeah, did you see that? There's a stretch goal. Yeah, get in there. Like, that's the reason why Kickstarter exists. There's one element of it where like, hey, you know, if this doesn't work, we're financially secure. But the other thing is like, these things typically pop off as long as you have a semi-good product, right? You're able to package things together in bundles a lot easier, ship them out, drill up all that hype, have different levels that people are buying into, then start having stretch goals. People are like, oh boy, we hit this stretch goal. Now's the time to buy in. Like, it's its own hype machine that sells a product for you. And so, you know, like I said, my part is it doesn't support the stores, but is Privateer Press going to be doing Kickstarters going forward? Yeah, of course they are. It makes money. It's safe. It's actually just like a good way of doing it as well, because we're having trouble with distributors. We could just talk about this whole thing separately with like distributors, but that's been a separate issue. And this is almost kind of like their way of fixing it, is doing this out through Kickstarter as opposed to these distributors. But that's a different conversation. That's all the main reasons I wrote down here for why Jake thinks that Warmachine sucks. There was also the argument made all the way through, kind of being like, you know, as like an answer to some of these things, is that we need a Mark IV, and we need a Mark IV, and we need a Mark IV. This one is going to be a half point. I'm going to give Jake a D, I don't know, what's a half a ding? D? Whatever it's supposed to be, because first of all, the counter to that is no, it doesn't. The game as it is right now is solid. Rules-wise, awesome. Models-wise, everything is pretty close to what it should be. Balance-wise, everything is really close to what it should be. There's a couple of standouts, right, of things that are a little bit too strong. That could be fixed with a simple errata. You don't need to overall, like, change everything. Here's the counterpoint. We're coming out of a pandemic. Everybody is looking to get into the game. Everybody is worried that, hey, my game has been quiet for a year and a half. And I'm not just talking about Warmachine. I'm talking about lots of games out of there. And you know how I talked about that Kickstarter and that hype machine and pulling things in? That's what you might need Mark IV to be. You wouldn't have to even make a lot of changes. You just like slap a new cover on a book, being like, this is Mark 3.1, just like a little bit of changes there. More so, okay, we're now kicking into this new campaign. Orgoth are coming in. This is happening. Here's our new starter set. You can get this here on Kickstarter, because you know it's going to be on Kickstarter. And like everyone's like, yeah, you know, like Warmachine. Hey, you know how you hated Mark III for whatever reason? Time to come back in. Hey, you know how you were like starting to play WoW instead of playing Warmachine? Now's the time to come back in. Hype, hype, hype. Go, go, go. But that kind of more goes with everything else, where we need to kind of like crack the silence and get things going again. So that's why I give it like the D for like the half thing, is because honestly, the game does not need a Mark IV. However, given where we are and where we might want to spark for hype, a Mark IV might be a way to go. And something that I kind of feel is that like there has been a kind of a quiet for Warmachine while they've been looking at the other stuff. It could be that that's happening because behind the scenes, they have somebody looking at Mark IV or something like that. So, you know, like, I don't think we'll see anything for like right away, right? It's not like, oh, Kickstarter starts right after this thing here. But I mean, I would assume that they have something big planned for like, you know, like Q1 of 2022 or something like that. So until then, you know what? This is my closeout for all this. Until then, if you find that your gaming group is stale and things are boring, instead of talking to your game group and being like, man, I hate this game is bad because of this and this and this and this and this, the more productive conversation to be had is, look everybody here, like we've been playing together for a long time and I'm feeling a little bit bored. Things are getting a little bit stale. These are the things I'm finding here. But what I want to say is, what can we do to liven things up here? You know, like, what can we do? Should we try Warmachine for a while? Maybe we'll do a thing where like any caster you use, you can't use again for X weeks, right? So that forces you to use all these different casters. Or, you know, you can't use a caster again until you win with 3 other casters or something like that. Or, you know what, this person keeps winning. We're going to do a handicap type thing so that whenever you win a game, next game you're going to be playing like 5 points down. And if you lose a game, next game you're going to be playing 5 points up. Just to kind of like even the field, you know, your list changes will be like, it's like, hey, now I got 5 or 5 less points. Your list will be different. You know what? For our next tournament, let's do a doubles, right? Like, take on that a new initiative, liven things up. But if you can't do that, if it's in your heart and you're like, you know what? Like, I'm just not feeling it, man. Like Warmachine, I just can't right now. I used to love it, but right now I'm burnt out. The way that you fix burnt out is you take a break, and there's nothing wrong with that, right? Sharpening the saw, taking that time to be like, hey, you know what? Let's play something else for a while. It sounds like you want something that's like faster and wacky and stuff like that. Play a different game, do that for a bit, but save your scorn, come back to Warmachine later, because honestly, you know, like the whole title of this video is that Warmachine sucks. It doesn't. Warmachine is fantastic. It's in a fantastic spot. And we'll all be here with open arms when you come back. So there you go. There's my civil reply to the Jake Paints Minis video. And otherwise, we'll talk to you later. Bye.